What if the reason so many high-achieving, high-functioning adults feel exhausted isn't because they need more confidence, but because they've lost clarity about who they are? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies that help us live longer, healthier, and more purposeful lives. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age. In this episode, we explore the growing identity crisis beneath modern burnout culture. My guest is Dr. Moyer, Ph.D. in educational psychology and author of Redeeming Identity. Dr. Moyer argues that we've treated identity like open source software, believing we can boost or identify our way to a better version of ourselves at will. Instead of flourishing, many of us are experiencing what he calls a total system crash. Today, we'll unpack why building self-esteem without a rooted identity is like attempting a 3,000-piece puzzle without the picture on the box, and what it actually takes to build a life that holds together over time. Dr. Moyer, welcome to the Aging Well podcast. Let's have you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to your interest in educational psychology and more specifically identity.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here. My interest in educational psychology actually was that I actually started off as a teacher. So I started off actually as a mathematics teacher. And I taught for several years as a teacher in middle school and high school, and then transitioned into doing educational consulting for districts and schools. Then I kind of moved into ministry for several years, my wife and I, where I took my experience in education and consulting and kind of worked in the field of ministry, specifically with children's ministry and discipleship. But then kind of God took me on a different path and kind of closed some doors that I was thinking the direction I was going towards. And I was left kind of going, okay, so what do I do now? And the path opened to going back to school and getting my Ph.D. In educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. And it was actually during a class in human development, lifespan human development, how do we develop, where the professor first introduced the importance and the idea of identity and the psychological idea of it. And it just intrigued me from a person who was a teacher and worked in ministry, and how that all very much impacted how people developed. But what I saw from a spiritual side, that many times people wanted to grow and change and transform from a spiritual side, but they didn't really know how to do it. They didn't really know how to grow in that side of who they were. And as I was looking at identity, because I was interested, I found a really interesting bridge in the Bible, Christianity, around the identity and how that connects. And so that actually started me on a multi-year study of the connection of the psychological side and the religious or spiritual side of identity and how they interact, which then, talking with pastors and ministry leaders, I kept getting asked the question, so when are you writing a book? And you're a teacher. The best way to learn something is to actually have to teach it. The best way to become an expert on something is having to write a book about it. And so I ended up taking a year and a half and writing Redeeming Identity, which is the book that we just finished publishing.
So in that, you argue that we've treated identity like open source software, and I love that phrase. What do you mean by that, and how did we get there culturally?
Wow. Well, I think in our culture, what we have done is we've treated it like it's a plug and play a little bit. I mean, open source software is another way of thinking about it, is that we can just change our identity just by putting on a new label. I don't know if you remember, there's a restaurant out. It used to be a much bigger restaurant. I don't see them as many times anymore, but TGIF.
Oh yeah.
And I remember TGIF because their hostesses and their servers always wore suspenders, and they always had a myriad of pins on their suspenders. And if you ever asked them about their pins, they were always very proud about their pins because it was kind of like an identification of who they were in pin format. And I sometimes think that that's the way we treat identity anymore. Is like, if I want to be this, I just take a pin and I put a new pin on, and now this is who I am because I've put this pin on. I want to be. I want to be. I want to take on this role, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to say that this is who I am and this is what I'm going to go to. And I think that identity, from a psychological standpoint, is much deeper, and it's because, and it goes down to a lot of the meanings that we have of things. But how have we gotten here? Wow, I think there's a whole book. I'm trying to remember the name of the book that someone wrote that I think has tried to take a. I'll see if I can find it for you and send it to you. But it took a look at identity from the Enlightenment period all the way through to modern period, and tried to look at the main people who have introduced how we think about identity and how we've gotten to this point. But his point, his thought was, and I think the argument that he was making, is that we are now in this place of radical individualism, if you want to think about it this way, where the goal is that we should, in our society, have the ability to define not just who we are, but then everyone else needs to be in the purpose of validating that at the same time. And so whatever you say you are, we're supposed to validate that. But at the same time, if the challenge comes that if there's no foundation for that definition of who we are, it's like trying to build a Lego structure in a bouncy house, because the foundation is constantly changing, and you can never really get anything solid underneath of you.
If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast. I like that. So why do you believe our modern self-esteem movement, while it may be very well-intentioned, has contributed to our instability rather than our resilience?
Oh, self-esteem. I was a teacher. Whenever I was a teacher, that was the big deal. Was everything was about self-esteem. Grades were about self-esteem, and that's a great example in this. Is everyone knows at this point, or have heard the idea of grade inflation, is that everyone expects to get an A at this point. Well, that's a component of the issue of self-esteem. Self-esteem, just by the nature of it, is something that comes from who we are and the realization of our own successes. So self-esteem, the problem that we have with it is that it is many times validated. What we're looking for is we're looking for constant validation. And the validation comes from the outside. And so what you end up having is, if you have someone who has really low self-esteem, you've probably heard the research around this. People with low self-esteem, they end up getting depression, they can have anxiety, they can have all of these different issues from a mental health status. And we, many times in our performance culture, think that, okay, great, the opposite must be really awesome, having high self-esteem. Well, the problem with that is that super high self-esteem can end up with a very hyper self-focus, which leads to narcissism. And you also end up having a lot of people who have very high self-esteem that end up having anxiety as well, trying to maintain that high self-esteem. And sometimes they even get into a um trying to remember the term right now, imposter syndrome, where they're trying to constantly keep that high self-esteem, but they always feel like they're faking it. And so whenever I've talked with people about self-esteem, I use the term that I would rather not be in either of those two places. I like saying what I want people to be is I want people to be humble. I don't know if you've heard the term. The term, it has a lot of religious connotations, but many people think humble is like, oh, I'm down on myself. No, that's not really what it's supposed to be. Humility, in its real definition, is an honest evaluation, an honest understanding of who you are. And so I think that that's where we want people to be, is to really get a good understanding of who they are. What are their strengths? What are they really good at? What is the things that they have talents for, drives towards, that they can really do well? What are the things that they may not be as strong at, but they could continue to grow, they could continue to develop, they continue to improve in those areas? But instead of trying to think that they always have to be attaining and successful in every single area of their life, be honest about who they are. And I think that that's a much more healthy place to be.
And I think that's where, we talk a lot on this podcast, and, I've taught it for years, that I like to put parentheses around extra and extraordinary, because, we can be in the most ordinary of circumstances, but if we have identity in that, and we treasure what we do, and we see the big P purpose in doing that,
Right.
we can accomplish so much more. But I think so much of our society is driving us toward, we have to be a celebrity. We have to be, how many likes am I getting on social media, and all those types of things, rather than being focused on, how well am I doing the things I'm intended to do on this earth? That we're all here created for a purpose. Living that purpose, we don't have to live somebody else's purpose. We need to live ours as fully as possible.
Oh, absolutely. That is a big deal. I think probably one of the worst things that could have happened to our culture is the role of influencer. Because if you ask how many teenagers, what is their goal in life? I want to be an influencer. Okay, you can be an influencer anywhere. I love the idea of extra in the ordinary, because you can be an influencer anywhere that you are. It doesn't mean, though, whenever people think they want to be an influencer, they want to be an influencer over hundreds of thousands of people. Well, that may, I mean, there's drawbacks of that, that if you ask those people, they're always having to be on display.
Right. And what's the significance in that level of, you might so-called influence hundreds of thousands of people, but what real influence are you having? Whereas the significance of the influence of affecting one life could be so much greater.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The other part I think that is interesting in that idea of influencer is so many times those people who are influenced, they're trying to become like the person that's the influencer. And I love what you said before. That's more than likely they were not created to be like that person. They were created to be who they are.
Right.
So instead of trying to become someone that you weren't supposed to be, wouldn't it be better to figure out who you were meant to be, and then learn to live into that? That's where you're going to find everything that you think you're trying to get because by following that influencer, you're not going to find it that way. You're going to find it by trying to figure out who you were meant to be and living out of that.
So you use an analogy of a 3,000 piece puzzle without a picture on the box. And I do 1,000 piece puzzles, and I'm dependent upon that picture on the box. But what is the picture that most people are missing?
Oh, the picture that most people are missing is but I put it this way. I take it back to the origins. So and mine has my book has a very Christian perspective on this. And so the origin of what we were created for and the purpose that you said is we were created for a purpose. And the main purpose that we were created for was to be image bearers of God. And the challenge is through the fall of man, basically we lost that relationship with God. So because we lost that relationship with God, we don't have that picture, that image that we were supposed to reflect, we were supposed to bear. And so we're going through life looking for who we were meant to be, and we're grasping at these pieces and trying to figure out how they put together. And on top of not having the picture, there are pieces from other puzzles that are being given to us that we're never supposed to fit into our puzzle. But we don't know that because we don't have that relationship to focus on who we were meant to be. But that's the whole idea of redeeming identity, is that there was a way for us to have that relationship restored. But once that relationship is restored, then we can then really start figuring out who is God. That's really the first question. And based on that, who were we meant to be? How were we supposed to reflect him in the unique way that we were created to?
I love that. And honestly, that is a concept that doesn't have to be tied strictly to religion. I mean, if you just think of spiritual in its most raw sense, where it's, you're just a part of something greater than yourself.
Yeah.
Then what is that greater than self? What is that image of the greater than self? And how do I fit into this?
Oh yeah, that was the idea of Viktor Frankl in his book about purpose, is that we were all meant for a purpose. And I think that that's a big piece of that. And many times it comes from having a perspective without us at the center, but that there is something bigger than us. And in my book, it's God. But in other spiritual disciplines, they do go to other spiritual ideas. But it's that idea that there is a spiritual reality outside of us, a bigger thing that we were meant to be a part of.
And I favor, when I write God anymore, I will use kind of the small caps, so similar to how Lord is written in the Christian Old Testament, to signify that my concept of God is small relative to the reality of God. And it kind of, to me, keeps me a little bit more humble in my faith that, I don't have all the answers, and we all have a different perspective of God, and we're all working toward kind of accomplishing that, moving in that direction. And I kind of favor, if you've ever heard of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, he was a Jesuit priest and paleontologist. He came up with the concept of the omega point, and, just thinking, that we are spiritually evolving toward this unity, this greater community, this greater love, what I would identify as God, and so I think it's important that we understand how our identity, how our personhood fits into that whole bigger picture, whether we, profess a faith or not. I mean, it's there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to what I said earlier. A lot of times our identity, whenever we really start talking about identity, it's moving beyond the labels that we put on things, but it's really having the understanding of what is the meaning that we put onto those labels. It's what does that mean on the core of who we are and the inside of who we are. And in the book, the framework that I give that is I basically say is that our identity is made up of four components, four aspects, which makes up who we are. And they are the principles, the perspectives, the purposes, and the priorities. So if you take those four things, this is the core of who you are. And it doesn't get changed just by adding a label on. It's the question of what does that really mean? And how does that then relate to what do we do? How do we see things? What is our priorities? And so it's those four P's, the principles, perspectives, purposes, and priorities that really then help us define and really have a greater understanding of whenever I say, this is who I am, it's not saying I am this because this is what I've done, but it's recognizing that I chose those things because there is something inside of me that said that that was important.
Let's pause briefly to acknowledge an affiliate partner that helps support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored and we don't accept paid placements, but when you use our affiliate links, it helps us continue creating this show. One product I've personally vetted and believe in is Nemo, a simple but thoughtful solution designed to support knee comfort and mobility during daily activities. I appreciate its practical design, ease of use, and focus on helping people stay active as they age. It's a product I'm comfortable recommending because it aligns with our philosophy of supporting movement, function, and independence. If you'd like to support the podcast and learn more about Nemo, you'll find the link in the show notes. So let's kind of go to three other P's that aren't included in that. And how does identity differ from personality, preference, and performance?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, preference, I think, really is incorporated in those four P's. That's kind of why I tried to think about the things that end up dealing with us. Preference is really about what do we like to do? It goes to our priorities. It's what is important to me, what is not important to me. How do I make decisions? And so usually our preferences is kind of goes along with our priorities. So it's like, if I had to choose between doing this and doing this, I'm going to go this direction because this is my priority or my preference, which, if you want to use that terminology. Performance, I think, also is incorporated into those four P's. I think that's where we get into purpose. It's our motivation. Why do we do things? It's that bigger, whenever I think about purpose, it's like I said, the Viktor Frankl purpose. It's that, what is that bigger thing that gets me up in the morning and tells me this is what I'm focused on. This is what I'm going to be doing. You're a university professor. I've been a teacher in all of our lives. There's a reason why we went into fields where we teach and we're about education. We're about helping people grow, change, develop. And education is something that is many times very others focused. And there's something around our purpose, our internal purpose, our internal motivation that drives us to do that. But that also then leads to our performance, because if I'm living into my purpose, then my performance is going to align to that. Many times, though, whenever people are doing something, but it's really not aligned to a purpose, then that's where a lot of times performance is not there. Personality, that's the one that I think is an interesting one, because there's so many aspects of personality that I kind of let that be a little bit separate from identity, in the sense that I think I think it could be an aspect of it, but there's so much research in personality, and that I didn't kind of want to incorporate that into identity, but I think it does have aspects of it. Personality is kind of like, how do we kind of show up for, in ourselves? It's like, are you an introvert or are you an extrovert? Are you a optimist or are you a pessimist? Do you see things? And that can be sometimes a little bit in the perspective side. So sometimes I think the way that personality shows up is a little bit more in our understanding from an identity side and how we see things, our perspectives, which also then goes to our priorities somewhat. How do we define things? Do we define things as, if you're someone who's extremely anxious, then many times the way that you have defined things is that things are very scary. Things are very, you're living in a world that you see things as very much against you, rather than seeing another person who is not as anxious, sees things as everything as an adventure that's ahead of them.
And can some of that come from a bit of a disconnect from, identity going into those different parameters that, if we perceive our identity somewhat incorrectly, or we look at like performance. If I fail at something, then I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, when sometimes failure in itself is part
Right.
of our identity. It's enabling us to grow because we're learning from that failure.
Absolutely. I think it is part of I think the way that we deal with adversity, deal with struggles, deal with challenges, it does say a lot about our identity. It says a lot about our perspectives on things. You just said it there. It's, how do we see struggles? How do we see challenges? How do we see failures? Maxwell, I think Maxwell is the one that wrote the book Failing Forward. I think
I think so,
he's one of
yeah.
those. And his perspective is that whenever you fail, whenever something isn't going right, it's not that that's a failure, and so you have to take that personally and that you're a failure, which is how some people are taught. That's the way that they are raised, and with the definition is that failure on your side means that that's who you are. That's the definition, rather than failure is an opportunity to learn about how something didn't work and what can be done differently. My wife loves the story of Edison and the light bulb, where I don't know if you've heard that one before, but it's like he tried to create the light bulb, and he tried like 1,000 different ways before he found the one that worked. And whenever he was asked about that, it's like, no, it's not that I failed 1,000 times. I just found 1,000 different ways that it didn't work until I came to the one that did. And
Yeah, that's
sometimes that's a great way to think about it.
I was going to say that's an important way to approach life, is that,
Hmm.
failure, we're going to fail more times than we're quote unquote successful, but those failures are where we're learning. And
Absolutely.
speaking of being an educator, I taught I still teach it, but it was a different institution when I first started teaching pathophysiology and exercise. I took the approach where I wanted the students to miss questions so that they would learn from it, because it was a mindset that, if you get all the questions right on an exam, I'm not really testing you for what you know, and you're not really learning from it. And,
Hmm.
taking that approach, I had a bunch of educators at the university that were like, you can't do that. That's really damaging to, the student's self-esteem. As we were talking about self-esteem earlier, I'm like,
Yeah.
really? But then I had a student once who, she was one of the best students in the class, and she comes up to me after class one day. It's like, what do I need to do to improve my grades in here? And I was like, what are you talking about? You have like one of the highest grades in the class. She said, yeah, but I'm getting C's. And I said, no, you're not. I curved the exams. You're actually one of the top in the class. And she said, but you don't understand. I don't get C's. It's like, okay, relax. You're not getting a C, but I want you to learn. And I had a professor
Right.
in anatomy that, I don't know how I got through, my 3 years of anatomy in my Ph.D. program, because they were all oral exams, and Dr. Moore would come in and he would just grill us on what we had been dissecting that week. And he had a knack for knowing what you didn't know. And he would ask you those questions. And I'm like, how am I getting A's in this class? Because I had every question wrong. And it wasn't until I got to my comprehensive exams, and as a PhD, you understand those, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your oral comprehensive exams. And I'd asked him, well, what should I focus on in preparation? He's like, well, just focus on the things you missed on the written part of the exam, which I hadn't missed that much. But so I focused on those, come in, he asked me those questions, got them right. And he starts asking me questions, getting further and further away from what I really studied. And then the last question he asked me was something I would not have studied. It was like, if you make an incision through the abdominal wall, what layers would you encounter from superficial to deep? I'm like, oh my, okay, well, think about it. You studied the skin. And I worked my way through, and he's like, wow, I didn't expect you to get all that. I'm done. And a friend of mine afterwards was like, do you realize that you just aced your comprehensive exams? And I'm not the brightest person in the world. I'm a good student, and that's how I got a PhD. But I realized that I learned how to know and learn and think my way through things. And failure helps us to grow into and understand what we are trying to accomplish. And there has been no growth in knowledge from people just memorizing what people already know.
One of the best definitions, and I would love to claim this as my own, but I will always give this away to Summit. But the best definitions for learning was positive struggle.
Yeah.
If you're not struggling, if you're not being challenged, if you're not in a way even having little moments of failure, doesn't have to be big moments of failure, but even just little moments where you have to stop and say, I don't know that. You're not learning, because you need to have something that stretches the boundaries of what you know, or creates a cognitive dissonance, which I love that term, cognitive dissonance between what you think you know and what is really true. Because that's when you have to learn. You have to engage, and you have to struggle with that and let it create those in the brain, as you know, those mental maps, those pathways in the brain that are new, that then is what creates the neural networks that create those memories and creates the way that we think. But it takes that positive struggle. It takes those stretching. It's like, you do, from what you said, it's like a muscle. For a muscle to grow, it has to tear a little bit for it to then build new muscle. The same thing is true in our brains. We have to have that positive struggle.
And I think it's across the board. It's like spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. All of those dimensions require struggle. And, when you hear people say, well, if God's a loving God, how can he make us suffer? Well, first of all, he's not making us suffer. We suffer on our own accord. But that suffering is there for our growth. One of the things that gives me the most optimism right now in our society is that I have that hope of the spiritual evolution that, right now, because I also studied geology as an undergrad. How I got from geology to exercise physiology is a whole nother story. But thinking of like a fault line, the tension builds up before that fault slips. But when that fault slips, there's destruction, and there's a lot of, force going into that. But it's what creates, we wouldn't have the beautiful mountains and landscapes and stuff we had if it wasn't for the tension in our, tectonic plates and everything as they're sliding. And so the tension in life is what brings the beauty forward. And I think right now we might be in a state of tremendous tension in the world. But if we act accordingly, some beautiful stuff will come out of it. And I'm confident of that.
Absolutely. It's that tension, like you said, the struggle. Going back to the Bible, which I think is just is source of wisdom, it says that be thankful for those times when we struggle. And people read that. It's like, you want us to be thankful for the times that we struggle. Yeah, because that is the moment that bring forth patience. And then that out of that patience comes hope. And out of that hope comes peace. And out of that peace comes love. So it's that the struggle is there to help us see those places. And this is kind of where I take that with identity, is those places where within our own identity, we have a piece of who we are that doesn't line up with reality, doesn't line up with who we were supposed to be. So sometimes we need to be willing to let something go so that it can be replaced with something better.
And so
and
along
that
that
struggle
line,
helps us there. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, along those lines, how does disordered priorities and perspectives show up as anxiety? I mean, we talked a little bit about anxiety, but what about burnout in our lives?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's whenever I think we have, and I think you just said it there a second ago, disordered priorities is, and I think Frankl talked about this, is whenever we have disordered priorities and disordered purposes, is whenever we are really focused on doing something that really is not what we were meant to be. And we're putting all of our energy and we're putting all of our choices and all of our work into doing something that eventually drains us, instead of something that really gives us energy and gives us something that whenever I'm waking up in the morning, I'm going, I am excited about what's going to come today, whether it's something that's easy or it's something that may be even challenging, but I'm excited for the opportunity that is coming. Because then our motivation and our priorities are kind of all in line. But whenever we have a purpose, but our priorities are something else, and we're spending all of our time doing something that is pulling us away from what our purpose is, then it ends up draining us. There's a story in the book I really love about priorities, and I think it changes the way it made me think about priorities. And it was an old successful businessman is seen by this young person who wants to succeed, and he says, "Okay, give me your best lesson about succeeding." And he's like, "Okay, here's what I want you to do tonight. Whenever you're in your room, go up and write out your 25 priorities, like 25 things that are important to you. And then I want you to take some time, think through those 25 things and circle the top 5. What is the top 5 things, priorities in your life?" And so he goes and he does it. And the next morning he sees the old guy and he says, "Okay, I did what you did. And I really loved the lesson. It really helped me think through." And he's like, "So what did you think you learned?" And he's like, "Well, what I learned is that I'm supposed to put those top 5 things and spend most of my time on those top 5, and then spend the rest of only give the rest of the time that I have to the other 25, to the other 20. And he was like, "No, that's not the lesson." And he said, "What you need to do is you need to take those other 20 and write over them, avoid at all cost. Because those are the things that will become the distractors in your life. Those are the things that are going to become the time suckers in your life, the energy suckers, the resource suckers. These are the things that are going to pull you away from what you're saying is the highest priority in your life." And I was like, it's so interesting, because that is so different than the way that I think we make decisions, is we think we're trying to do everything and be everything to everyone. And so we try to take on all 25 things instead of saying, what was I really meant here to be, and really putting my effort into that.
Let's pause for a moment to thank the affiliate partners who help support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored and no company pays for airtime here. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us keep producing thoughtful, evidence-informed content. One brand I genuinely trust is Oral Wellness, especially their Glutarol, Glutarol Plus, and copper peptide formulations. I've spent time vetting their science, their ingredient quality, and their transparency, and I personally use these products in my own wellness routine. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and exploring tools that may help you feel and function better, check out Aura Wellness in the show notes. Yeah, and listening to that, I was thinking of, we were all raised with Stephen Covey's, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and he talks about the importance versus urgency piece and how you have those quadrants. And I really enjoyed, I think it was Rory Vader. Is it Vader or Vaden? I think it's Vaden. Rory Vaden wrote the book, I think it's Positive Procrastination. And he takes it a step further and, adds a layer of significance to it. That it's not just whether something is important and urgent, is it significant? And that significance is kind of where you're talking about, if it's not significant, do away with all the other stuff. Because there might be a time when something is urgent and it might not be important to you, but it's significant. I think of, it's like your kid is playing the lead in the elementary school play, and it's like he has 2 lines. It's not necessarily urgent. Maybe it's not important to you because you have some other important business thing that has to go on, and yet it's significant. That's going to mean something to the kid to show up. I was thinking the movie Elf. Yep. And that's kind of where James Caan's character has to evolve through. He learns to understand that his job, while it's important and there's certain urgency, the more significant thing was his son and that relationship. And I think that's something that we miss horribly in life, is that we don't understand the significance of the things that we are intended to do.
Yeah, there was another book. I'll have to see if I can find the author, but it was called The Tyranny of the Urgent. And I think it was trying to communicate that many times people live in this place of constant urgency because everything is urgent. Everything is like, everything is a red light thing. Everything needs to be done. It needs to be done now. It needs to be done excellently, and it needs to be done like for other people. It's like all these other things that kind of create urgency. And I think it goes down to what you were just saying, is have we helped identify what is significant? What is really of the highest priority? What is the thing that really aligns to what our purpose is supposed to be? And that then really gets us to identity of, this is who I'm supposed to be. This is what I'm supposed to be focused on. This is what I'm supposed to be putting my energy and who I am into.
So along with that, you say that, Cure for Burnout isn't a boost. It's a return to our original design. What do you mean by that original design? Is that, and we've touched on it a little bit, so I know probably where you're going to go with it, but is it psychological, philosophical, spiritual, or is it all of the above?
I'm going to go with all of the above, because I think it is a recognition of that you're not trying to be everything to everyone. And it goes back to a little bit to the beginning of our conversation of being an influencer. It's you need to discover who you were meant to be, and you need to find out who that is and figure out what is your purpose, because that's going to be the place where you're not going to have misordered priorities. You're not going to be living in this constant state of burnout, trying to achieve something because you're trying to, and I wrote an article about this, is that many times in our culture, we create this performance identity where what we're trying to do is we're trying to perform so that we can achieve what we think needs to be achieved to get the accolades from whomever is around us. So many of us work in jobs, and what we do is we almost identify so much with our jobs that we create this performance identity around that job. And so what we do is we feel like our identity is to just constantly perform so we can go from one level of the job to the next level of the job to the next level of the job. And we're just constantly performing to get to that next level of the job. And then what happens if something happens, like you have a layoff and you don't have that job anymore? Well, who are you? Because what you've done is you've created this identity around this priority of being a performer. Didn't really have anything to do with your purpose. It was just really that you created this, I want to say, this performance identity around that priority of just constantly performing. Or like I think you said earlier, it's the person who's been working for a company for 30 years and finally retires, and he has no idea who he is because his entire identity was around performing in that job. So the idea of burnout, and whether it is burnout because you just burned out, or you finally are at a point where you don't have that job anymore, the bigger question needs to be, it's like, who were you supposed to be? Viktor Frankl actually, in his book, he actually relates a story of a person who was a successful businessman and was working with him, trying to figure out why he felt so anxious all the time. And what he figured out was this exact thing about performance. He was constantly doing things because of his business and what he was doing. But then he stepped back and he's like, okay, so why am I doing it? What is my real purpose? And he finally figured out that really what his purpose, what he really wanted to do in the long run, was something different. And he made a drastic change in his life to kind of go after that purpose. And even though it was not as stable because it was a big change, he lost the anxiety because he was now following after something that was more in line with who he was.
Yeah, I think sometimes we get kind of stuck in this aspirational identity where we think, we're moving toward an achievement rather than the achievement being in who we are right now in this moment.
Oh, absolutely. The goal is, we miss that the goal is not the bigger office or the bigger title or the larger paycheck. It is looking in the mirror and saying, I have achieved being the best version of who I was meant to be.
Sometimes that's like the only thing that keeps me going in my field because, as a college professor, I moved into a position where I'm kind of deadlocked. I can't move up. I can't move to a higher institution because I just haven't done the research and some of those types of things that would move me. And plus being a full professor now, it's like nobody's going to hire you because, they can hire somebody fresh out of their Ph.D. program. And oftentimes you start kind of slipping into this kind of struggle or, feeling like, a lost identity. And thankfully, I almost invariably will have a student reach out to me at that moment in time that just kind of gets me back on course. Like there was one time, just out of the blue, I got an email from a student who I had taught anatomy to, and we were talking one day over the cadaver, big place to have a conversation, as we're doing dissection. And, I mentioned to her about going to medical school, and she's, oh, no, I'm not going to medical school. Yes, really? I always had in my head that this person was going to med school. You should go into med school. And I left that institution, was at another institution, and I get an email from her saying, hey, Dr. Armstrong, I just wanted to let you know I got into med school. And it was just like, it just came at kind of that right time where it's like, okay, I'm doing something here. I might only be affecting one student in a number of years, but just changing that one life, who knows how many lives can be changed? Because, I may never get any fame for my job, But if I have one student who goes to med school, cures cancer,
right,
that's partly on me, and if I recognize that, then my life has more significance to it. If I looked at it and said, oh, look at this, I'm only making this amount of dollars. This student goes out and, I taught them and now they're making all this money and they've cured cancer and they're getting all this fame. That's the wrong way to approach identity. It's like my identity is, that was my purpose in helping that person get to that point.
Yeah, I think that's a whole point of perspective. It is having a perspective of it's not about me. I'm not the center of all of this. The world and everything does not exist so to make much of me. It is that I am a part of, as you said something earlier, something much bigger. And there's a part that I'm supposed to play. There's a purpose that I'm here. There's a role that I'm supposed to be playing. And it could be that I reach, whenever I was a teacher, it was if I teach 30 or 60 kids and I positively influence them so that they have a vision for they have the ability to go on and do something different than what they came in with, I made a difference. But if as I write the book, as I'm putting that out there, if I know that there are people that have picked up the book, read it, and go, okay, I have a purpose, I have an identity that I was meant to live into, and there is a pathway for me to discover who that is and live into that, and that gives them hope, and that gives them a plan and a way of looking at things that is different than what I think our current culture says, where it's all about immediate happiness. I mean, I think so much of our culture is so much immediate gratification. And it's not about that. It's having a longer term perspective on this. Then there's a success there. I played a part in helping that person, those individuals grow and become more of who they were meant to be. And hopefully as they do that, that's going to then influence other people, which then will influence other people. And hopefully it will move the culture closer to what it was always meant to be as well.
Does that make life feel so much more rewarding when you have that perspective?
Oh, yeah. It's whenever you're part of a bigger plan, a bigger purpose. It's you're living for something. You're not constantly always chasing something, and I think there's a difference there.
So, for someone who's listening or watching this podcast and feels fragmented or stuck, what's the first step they should take toward rebuilding a rooted identity?
Wow.
Besides buy the book.
No, well, that's of course the first thing that they should do. Actually, the first thing is going to be kind of a simple one, but I actually just was doing a podcast last week with a gentleman that works with individuals that go through the 12-step program. And the 12-step programs always have the same starting point. They always do. It's just be willing to recognize that we have a problem. It really doesn't matter what that problem is. Whenever we were having the conversation, it's like the way that I bring it up is we all live out of a corrupted identity. We live out of a fragmented identity. We live out of an identity that we were never meant to live out of. And I think that the first step in moving in the right direction of discovering who you were meant to be is first being willing to admit that you're not that already. Is being willing to ask the question, okay, this is who I have become, but I'm not yet who I'm supposed to be. So that first step of recognizing that I haven't yet arrived, and I think that this is the part that is so much more commonplace in our culture, is that I've settled. I talk about in the book that many people, whenever they're going through crises, they'll be willing to say, it's like, okay, I'm not who I'm supposed to be. But I think so many more people are comfortable and they settle for an identity that is less than what they were meant for. And I think sometimes that's the bigger challenge, is being willing to admit and recognize, you know what, there's something more. And I think that's the beginning point, because that's when you're open to learning. You're opening to struggle. You're opening to being challenged. And you're opening to discovering who you could become.
So do you see identity? I always present my SPIES model of the Well-Centered Fitness as an asymptote. And as a math teacher, you would know what an asymptote is. A lot of people don't know what it is. But would you almost look at identity as being an asymptote too, that as we progress through life, we're getting closer and closer to a fuller understanding of who we are and what we're supposed to be?
Oh, yeah. That's exactly the way that I approach it. It's this, we're never going to reach perfection. That's the one thing about an asymptote. Yeah, it's that thing that we're getting closer and closer and closer to, but we never quite ever reach it. But what we always want is we want to be getting closer and closer to it. It's the idea of progress, not perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to avoid the plateaus, the places where we kind of just get there and we settle. It's like, okay, I'm comfortable. I don't need to change. I don't need to move any further. I'm kind of good here. I'm in my groove. Well, the moment that you get in a groove, that means you're stuck. And what we want to constantly be progressing, moving closer to that asymptote. But yeah, I think it's a great, wonderful mathematical analogy for that.
Yeah. I got to always pull in exercise and physiology and mathematics and all those things into my analogies. So
love it.
That works for me. So what role does community play, though, in stabilizing identity? And I just talked about really identity not necessarily being stable, but I guess maybe reframe that to community playing a role in bringing us closer to that asymptote of stability, of identity.
Oh, community is great in the sense of two things. I think it can give us the opportunity to learn. Whenever we surround ourselves with people, especially whenever we're willing to step out and see people that are different than we are, it goes back to that positive struggle. It's sometimes people have a different perspective on things than we do. Are we willing to listen to that different perspective? Are we willing to listen? I think that's become a lost part in our culture so much, is the willingness to be around people that think differently than we do and accept that and still appreciate the perspective that they come from, the background that they come from, the priorities that they may have. One of the sad things I've seen in family, in people, I don't know if you've seen this, is people kind of group around people that are just like them.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that can stabilize our identity, but sometimes that can stunt our identity, because the only perspectives and the only things that we're hearing are the same things that everyone else is saying, because we've gotten into this place of everyone around me is validating the same things that I'm thinking. Wouldn't it be great to sit around a table with people with very differing ideas and have a conversation and hear people that say something that you may absolutely 100% disagree with, but be willing to have the conversation with them. And you may hear something that that challenges a little bit of maybe where you come from and the perspective that you have, that may move you a little bit differently, and draw you closer to maybe who you were meant to be, but you might miss that because you're not giving yourself that opportunity.
Let's take a brief pause to recognize one of the affiliate offerings that helps support the Aging Well podcast. As always, we're not sponsored and we don't accept paid placements. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us continue producing this show. One product I genuinely enjoy is Firefly Organic Coffee, available through Jigsaw Health. It's thoughtfully sourced, organic, and crafted for people who care about what goes into their bodies, not just what wakes them up. I vetted it, I drink it myself, and I appreciate the care behind how it's made. If you'd like to support the podcast and check out Firefly Organic Coffee, you'll find the link in the show notes. Now, back to the show. I like being uncomfortable in group settings, where you're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit, and you have that back and forth, but you can always, at the end of the day, you can shake hands, you can have a beer
Absolutely.
together, whatever it might be. It's like you should be able to disagree even contentiously, but still do so with respect and with an understanding of moving toward better understanding of yourselves and of the world.
Right. And I think that is such a lost art, a lost understanding in community. I think many times whenever we've created our communities, we've created these self-protecting, self-replicating communities rather than these communities that really help us grow and challenge us in different ways.
So I'm going to move to questions I ask of all my guests. First, how do you define aging well?
Oh, I love the idea of aging is just a continuation of life, but you have so many more experiences than those that are younger, that you can bring so much more to it. For me, I think my perfect idea of aging well would be having the freedom to continue to grow into that asymptote, as you said, that identity, and having actually more time and freedom to discover who that is, because I'm not having the other competing priorities that go along sometimes with adulthood. But I think the other part of it is continuing to teach and train those under us to follow a better path than maybe what I did.
And what are you doing personally to age well?
Personally, I will say the thing that I'm doing is continuing to learn. I'm continuing to be a learner. I'm not sitting and thinking I have learned it all or I have experienced it all. I want to continue to learn. I want to continue to travel. I want to continue to have great conversations with people and meet new people and learn from them. I think the one thing, and you said this earlier, is that aging well is all of it. It's the physical, mental, spiritual. I think sometimes I need to spend a little bit more time on the physical than I do, so that my physical frame will be able to continue to work with the mental side.
Yeah, that's an important part of the asymptote. Everything needs to be kind of working toward there. And we're not always perfect in everything being perfectly centered, but where we have those areas that are a little bit off, then we work on those a little bit more while still working on the others. And so you get there. So if you could leave the audience with just one guiding principle for redeeming identity and preventing burnout, what would it be?
The thing I always tell people is the focus should be on who we are, not what we do. Because if we become who we were meant to be, what we do is going to come out of that, just naturally. It's like I was just up at Mount Vernon yesterday, and we saw all these wonderful gardens in Mount Vernon. They have these amazing trees that have been growing in Mount Vernon for hundreds of years. And they have apple trees and plum trees, and they've been treating the grounds and making sure that the trees grow well. The idea, though, of a tree is that it produces good fruit. And if there is not good fruit coming off of the tree, it's not because the fruit is bad, it's that there's something wrong at the roots. There's something wrong with the tree. And so I always encourage people to focus on who they are. Focus if there's an anxiety, if there is discouragement, if there's something going on, start asking the question of who am I? Or who have I allowed myself to become? What are those priorities and purposes that I'm allowing to dictate my life? Because if those have gone askew, who I am has gone a little bit off, that's going to impact who I am, which then is going to impact what I'm doing. But if we can get who I am back in alignment with what I was meant for, then what I do will come from that. So that's kind of the key takeaway I always want to give people from the book.
Profound words. And so, speaking of the book, where can our listeners and viewers learn more about your work? And more importantly, where can they find the book, Redeeming Identity?
Well, you can find the book almost anywhere. It is on Amazon. It is in Barnes & Noble. But if you want to find out more about my work with identity, I have a website. It's actually redeemingidentity.com. And you can find, I have articles. I have a podcast also that people can check into. And we talk a lot about different aspects of identity, as you can guess. But you can also check out the book and other things there. So thank you.
Right, we'll have links to that in the description notes.
Great.
Is there anything we failed to talk about today? I mean, I feel like I can keep talking to you because I love this topic, and I think it fits so well with, the aging well and our kind of transcendence and all those types of topics we talk about.
Yeah, no, I think this has been a great introduction to identity and the importance of it. I think that you have a great understanding of the identity of it, the importance of identity to life, including aging. I think that is one aspect of aging that I think is really good to remind people, that just because we're getting into that period of life that people think of getting older, it doesn't mean our life is over. It means that we actually have more opportunity to do things that we didn't have previously. We can both discover who we were meant to be in a way that we didn't have freedom to before, but then also we have the ability to think of others and share the wisdom that we have given to others. And I think that that's a great perspective and purpose to have as we move forward.
And we talk often in this podcast that aging well begins really even before birth. It begins at conception. Might even begin before that if you look at epigenetics, and we can go down a whole theological pathway as well with that as well. But I wholeheartedly believe that our identity, our purpose begins even before conception. And so the earlier that we can begin to identify the pathways of finding out who we are and what our purposes are and start moving toward that asymptote, the more successful we're going to be. And this has been a great conversation to guide us down that path. So thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate the conversation. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep helping us redeem our identity and keep aging well. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.